as we are getting started, let me just let you know that if you're a guest with us, we are in a sermon series called He is With Us. All right. See, this is getting good. I like this. This is warm and jolly. He is with us. And the idea is that we observe how God's presence is with God's people. God's presence is with God's people, right? And as we have been traversing through the Bible, starting in Genesis, and we will end in Revelation in a few weeks, we have observed how God has made a point to be with his people. Yesterday, a few of you have made comments about my haircut. I feel better. You just feel a little bit more confident when you got a nice haircut, And yesterday I was at the barbershop. I was getting my hair cut. And barbershop conversations, at least in black barbershops, are crazy. We could be talking about anything, like conspiracy theories and sports, conspiracies about sports. It's just all kinds of stuff. And yesterday, the subject of conversation was artificial intelligence. Yeah. So as I sat there getting my haircut, trying not to jump into the conversation, I listened and I heard some arguments that were just out of this world. They just did not make sense. I heard others that were compelling and sort of convinced me a bit, but it was only after a few minutes that I had to jump into the conversation. See, when we were talking about artificial intelligence, one of the big scary moments was that eventually, as this technology continues to grow, you will have something with you all the time that can tell you about the dangers that are coming, whether it's on the road or with weather or things that are happening in this world. That you would have something with you all the time that could tell you about your regular patterns in life, how you eat, how you drink, how you sleep, all of those things. You would have something with you all the time that could predict your thought process and could actually create opportunities for you to lean on its wisdom, opposed to having to wrestle with your wisdom. That could be beneficial for husbands who are married when you're asking what we want for dinner. But as they were talking through this, I just kind of jumped into the conversation to let them know this is already here. I mean, if you have a cell phone in your pocket, then you already have this technology around you at all times. If you are engaging with technology, you already have something that can be with you every moment of the day. And if you don't have control over it, it can actually have control over you. As I was talking through AI with him, I was reminded of a conversation that we had in Mid-Circle. Plug Mid-Circle, Wednesday night, 6 o'clock. That's our Bible study group. And we were talking in Mid-Circle about the idea that we just wish that we knew the right things to do all the time. Why can't God just come into our space and tell us the thing that we're supposed to do all the time? With every single decision, why can't he just be with us and show us and guide us so that we don't have to have the wrestle? And yet God, in this story, the story of the Bible, is constantly trying to convince us that he is with us all the time. That oftentimes it's not that his presence isn't there with us to lead us and guide us and to comfort us. Oftentimes we punt on the opportunity to trust him because we want something better right in the moment. We want something that more aligns with our desires. But as we saw last week, and we saw the week before, and we'll see this week and the next week and the next week, that regardless of whether we try to punt on this opportunity to have autonomy ourselves or to lean on God for his wisdom, and we throw that away so that we might have autonomy for ourselves, God is still this persistent presence that wants to be with his people, guide his people, and give his glory to his people. So to get us caught up, The first week we talked about the presence of God. How in the garden that was in Eden, Eden that was in the world, and the man was taken from the world and placed in the garden, which is in Eden. He shared this opportunity to have presence with God, that God was amongst him. He was amongst the people, two people. And yet, even though they had God with them all the time, telling them what was right and what was wrong, giving them wisdom, helping them shape their lives, what did they do? They said, our way is better than his way. They messed it all up. Last week, we talked about not just the presence of God, but the promise of God. And over and over and over, we see people trying to take life into their own hands, make their own choices, reject the wisdom of God and walk in the wisdom of man. And that creates what we call sin. Abraham, though, is a light for us. Abraham is a man that offers us an opportunity to hope. And Abraham has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob. We got a picture of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hey, I did this, y'all. And each of them got to experience the promise. Now, I just want you to catch this. God's presence was with two people. Then when it came to Abraham, God's presence, by the time Abraham was done, was with a group of people, a family of people. By the time it gets to Jacob, God's family is with a tribe of people. His presence is with a tribe of people. He is indeed looking to be with his people. God's desire is that his people be a part of the growth and development of creation, and he is standing with his people throughout. There's always this presence of darkness. The turn of the story is that no matter how good things go, there's always this presence of darkness. In the garden, the darkness there was covetousness and a lack of trust. And you see what happens. Genesis 4:16, it talks about Cain and how he went out from, look at this, the Lord's what? Presence. And from there on out, there are people outside of the Lord's presence. And this happens over and over and over. Jacob grows his family into a tribe. Jacob has many sons and daughters. He did a lot. But he had one son in particular, a man named Joseph. Joseph had strife with his brothers because Jacob favored Joseph. I'm trying to do the fast forward version of all of this. Here's the point. Joseph ends up in slavery in Egypt. There's a grand famine all over the world. That just means that they didn't have no food, y'all. And they move over to Egypt, only to find that the brother who they assume was dead because the darkness they had in their lives is alive. And what are the last few words that we see in Genesis that Jacob shares with his brothers? What was meant for evil, God meant for good. There's still this presence of shining light that comes through the darkness. But that darkness does not stop because they find themselves in a dark situation again. Look at Exodus chapter 2. That'll help us set the tone for our time today. Exodus chapter 2, it tells the story of why we are where we are. Verses 23 through 25, it says, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. Two people had the presence of God. Then a few people had the presence of God. A whole family has a presence of God. Now we're seeing a whole tribe of people who are seen and heard by God. They are slaves in a nation that they would have no power in and no hope in. and yet their cries do not fall by the wayside. The Bible tells us right here that in their pain and strife, their cries ascended to God. And this is a beautiful callback, because just as Abel was slain and his blood cried out to God, letting God know that his presence is needed right here on earth to deal with sin, the cries of these slaves go up to God as well. Now you can ask the question, well, where was God when all this darkness was happening? This is the question I've heard over and over and over. Where was God during the transatlantic slave trade? Where was God during that time? Where was God during the Holocaust? Where was God during that time? The darkness that is in this world. Where was God in that time? That's the question that should arise in our hearts. And yet right here, it does not show a God that is not listening or looking at his people. That somehow, some way, God's presence and promise relates to a plan to actually fix the problem of darkness. And keep looking, verse 24, it said, God heard their groaning and God remembered, he remembered the covenant with Abraham. Now, what do we talk about a covenant being? What is a covenant, y'all? It's a promise. It's a relationship between two where there is a promise, typically on both sides. Noah had a promise with God and they both had to do something. Abraham got a promise from God and they both had to do something. Right here in the midst of the darkness, it said God remembered the promise. God heard their groaning and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites and God knew. Let me just step away for a second. This is not in my notes. God sees, God hears, God knows. I mean, you can be tempted to believe that God has forgotten about the promise. You can be told that God has forgotten about the promise. He has not forgotten. This is generations after Abraham. Abraham is gone, dead, buried, turned into dust, and yet God remembers him when he sees and hears his people. God's covenant, his promise is so beautiful that he will work because of the promise, even if you haven't felt his presence. Just because you don't have this sense of God is with me right now does not mean he's forgotten about you. The promise is still valid. So there are some days where we just have to stand on the promises of God. That's what my grandma used to say. You have to stand on the promises of God. If I don't hear him or see him or feel him, I know that his promise is still valid. And yet, this promise is the reason why he would select another person to lead them. Y'all heard about Noah. He crossed the Red Sea and he freed his people and all of those things. God meets a man named Noah. Hey, I got another picture for y'all. Moses. I said Noah. Y'all got to edit that out. God sends a man named Moshe or Moses. And we won't get into the history of Moses. But it's interesting that when God meets Moses in the midst of his wilderness moment in his life, Moses sees him as a man that is in a burning bush. Now, if you know anything about the region, you know that burning bushes are not an anomaly. That there are burning bushes in the desert all the time just because of the sheer nature of the dryness. But the miracle is that God was there in a burning bush and it was not consumed. And in it, this is how Moses interacts with the presence of God. Now think about this. Years and years and years have passed, and now God is in the presence of man once again. The presence of man who also has a bit of the promise. And he appears as fire. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if I see a burning bush, I'm going that way. A fire is not my friend. I do not like fire. My dad used to make fires all the time growing up, and he liked the process of making a fire. I did not, because I understood how powerful fire is. That if the fire is not contained in a special way, that it could destroy everything. That if fire is not in the place where it's supposed to be, that it can break out and it cannot be stopped. This is God walking into the life of his people. That he's showing Moses, this is how powerful I am. And you need not to build something to contain me. I contain myself. I let you see and experience my power. I let you see and experience my glory. I let you see and experience my presence without you being consumed. And God is still doing the same right now. If God never changes, then do you think he's less powerful now? Do you think he ought not flex his muscle now? You think because Jesus came and died for your sin that he does not still have this presence of glory now? He's the same. That's why we don't need to be playing with God. That's why New Year's Eve, we're not playing all of that. No, we're not playing with God. I like to have fun, but I do not play with God. Because we know that his presence, if he would like to, would be a consuming fire. The bush was not consumed, but he certainly can consume all that he'd like. And God, as he interacts with this new person who will hold a promise, he gives him a promise that is threefold. He tells him, I will be your God. You will be my people. And I will dwell with you. I will be your God. You will be my people, and I will dwell with you. This is why I have a hard time believing that God is like just sitting there waiting for you to pickle. You know? Like this is why I struggle with the language when I came to God. Okay, I get what you're saying. You became awakened to God's presence and you responded rightly through faith. But if he says, I will be your God, you don't have a choice. He says to Moses, I will be your God. You will be my people, and I will dwell with you. And if you know anything about the word dwell, you know how impactful this is. That God decided to use a word that means I am just going to sit here and stay with you. The word dwell means this. It means to inhabit or to take up residence or to intentionally rest your presence. He says, I will dwell with you. It makes me think about, y'all have heard me talk about this before. You know how to categorize people who come to your home by how quickly they're willing to relax in your space. I mean, there are some people, they come to my house and as soon as they come to the door, you know, I'm set. You're not moving past me. You right here, you know. If you're a visitor and I don't really know you, we're going to have a front door conversation. And if it gets good, I'm going to say, yeah, let's sit down on the porch real quick and we can talk here. But if you are our friend, then you cross that threshold and you can make your way around the space. Robin's favorite thing is, are you going to give them the tour? I say, okay, we're going to give them the tour. A few of y'all laughing because y'all been on the tour. and we walk around the space, and we usually end up around the kitchen. And when we end around the kitchen, eventually they know, okay, we can grab a soda. Well, we don't have sodas, but you can grab a sparkling water. I know y'all hate on sparkling waters. I'm going to call those glory waters. You can grab a water. You can sit down. You can have some of our snacks because you are a friend. But if you family, like Vic is family, then many times he's come to whatever house we lived in. Vic sat right on the couch, and if he lift that leg up, I already know he's at home. God is not one who wants to even stand at your doorpost. He does not want to just stand in your doorway, check on you, make sure things are okay, and then say, sayonara, see you next Wednesday. And yet, many of us don't let God through the threshold. Many of us are selective about when we're going to let God in and when we need him to stay out. See, y'all might be like me, because when my house is junky and I don't really know you like that, you could be a friend and I still will be like, hey, we're just going to have to stand right here. And when your house is messy and when God comes to the door, are you willing to let him in with your mess? Or do you keep him at the doorway? See, God has no desire to just be a genie to you. He has no desire to be a companion to you. He is not Alexa or Siri or whatever AI there is out there where you can pick and choose when to interact with him. He says, I am your God. You are my people. I will dwell here. He's sitting on your couch. He's kicking his legs up. He's filled the closet with his clothes. He says that this is my space. Show me where the glory water is. I'll take a sip. This is God. He wants to be with you. So when he tells Moses, I will dwell with you, he basically tells him, make room, I'm coming home. Matter of fact, if we jump back into Exodus 25, verse 8, that's exactly what he says. He says to Moses that the people are to make a sanctuary for me. A sanctuary is simply a dwelling place, right? It's making sure that there is room there, that there's a space there, a special space there. You know, when we have family that come in town, we wash some sheets and we sometimes put the certain snacks out that we don't usually eat. This is that sacred space. God says, make the sanctuary for me so that I may dwell among them. So not only is he saying, I will dwell with you, Moses, he's saying, I will dwell with the entire nation of Israel. 2 people, a couple. A few people, a family, lots of people, a tribe. Now, God is willing to dwell with the entire nation. I hope you see what he's doing. Remember Genesis 2, that his plan was to start in the garden and flow down into the world. And right here, we can see it happening. And it takes us to our first point. That God has chosen to make his home with us. God has chosen to make his home with us. I remember when we were house shopping, there was certain stages to our house shopping. The first one was, we want a house. And when you just want a house, you drive around, ooh, that's nice over there. 5 stories, I can see myself in that. You drive down the street, ooh, they got a game room in there. Wow, I would play there. I got all these kids. Matter of fact, we can have more kids so that we can play in the game room. Then something shifts when you realize what you can afford. And you start making all kind of exceptions. You're like, oh yeah, we only need 1 bedroom. It's just us. We choose a house based off of the limitations that we have. We choose a space where we are going to dwell based on the limitations we have and the hope that we have for the future. So there are some of us who will take a little bit of gamble because we know that there might be some growth that happens in our lives, but it's still based on the limitations of our mind, our imagination, and our pockets. God does not have limitations. So when he chooses a space, it may not make sense to you. Why would God come and dwell with a people who don't have a king and they don't have a government and they don't have money and they don't have resources? Because he wants them to know that he is what makes the house, not them. Listen, God dwells where he wants to, and he's chosen to make his home with people who could offer him nothing. And if you've ever been in a space where you don't have anything to offer to God, then you know how powerful this is. When you don't have a praise to give him, when you don't have a day to serve, when you don't have an opportunity to go do the things that God has called you to do, when you can't think of the verse, when you can't preach to yourself, this is the time when you need to know that God is with you. That it's not always through a Bible study or being able to go through a sermon that you recorded a few years ago. Sometimes all you can do is depend on the promise that he's made and the presence that he's giving you. God has chosen to make his home with us. My question to all of us is, have you made room? Have you made room in your life for God who wants to walk through the threshold? You think God doesn't know your house is dirty? He knows. You think that God has not already thought through the fact that your house is not up to par? He knows that. Listen, God is not afraid of your dirty socks or your dirty drawers, your fornication or your porn addiction. He's not afraid of none of that. He'll cross the threshold. And where sin tries to interrupt the relationship with God, God is still persistent in wanting to be with his people. So the story goes on, and God is speaking to Moses as he's in a mountain. And if I had time, I'd break all this down, but he's in a mountain, picture this, or on a mountain, picture this, and there's this glory cloud that is sitting there. Once again, Moses is in this place where he knows that God is close to him. And the word glory is shown because Moses can display or at least express that this is a weightiness. This is a heaviness that is there. And while he is on the mountain, let me show you how sin tries to interrupt. While he is there, loving this opportunity to be there with God, while he is there just breathing in all the glory of God, the people are at the base of the mountain and they have this grand idea. Let's make a golden calf. I don't have time to break it down. Let me just... See, back in that day, people thought they did not have a God if they could not see a God. Sin creeps in when we want to see God because we think that when we don't see him, he is not with us. That God had just delivered them out of slavery. He had walked them through a sea where the waters are held back like walls. He's fed them in the midst of the wilderness. And they say, because we can't see him, Moses must be lost. So let's make a calf so that we can experience his presence. Sin creeps in that way. See, sin is a sign that we have not made room for God to dwell with us. And at the root of our sin is not trusting that God will actually take care of what we've worried about the entire time. Y'all missed that. At the root of your sin is this deep disbelief that God can't take care of what you've been worrying about. So if you're giving your body away, it's because you don't trust that God, you don't trust God with your love or with your pleasure. That he doesn't know enough about you. He doesn't know what you like or who you like. That's what it means. If you are wanting something that's not yours, it means that you do not trust God's provision. That either you think that you're not good enough or you think that he don't have enough. If you are a person who likes to overconsume, you're ordering from Crumble Cookie every day, it means that you do not trust God's fulfillment and you do not trust his plan for your body. If you're a person who thinks too much about yourself, whether on one side you have become consumed with yourself and it shows in the way of narcissism, or on the other side you are consumed with yourself and it shows by constant anxiety. If you're in that realm, you don't trust that God has truly made what he has made with magnificence, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and he has created a plan and a path for you, and that he will walk with you and guide you throughout the way. All sin is rooted in disbelief of God, that there's something that we do not believe about him. And when we do not trust God, we act against God. When we do not trust God, that's when we act against it. I heard a whole lot of amens when we were talking about the mountaintop. But when we don't trust God, that's when we act against God. So it might be a good practice for us as we are meeting with God in prayer, as we are meeting with God in the scriptures, as we are meeting with God in the assembly, to ask yourself deep down inside, do I really trust God? God, do I trust you? Be with me. Help my unbelief, as it says in the scriptures. And this moving against God did not, again, push God away. Because there it created an opportunity where Moses could stand and introduce something important. Someone who would intercede for the people of God in their sin so that God might remember the promise once again. Look at Exodus 32. Exodus 32, we only got an hour left, y'all. Exodus 32, 9 and 10. It says this: the Lord also said to Moses, I have seen this people, and they are indeed stiff-necked people. Now, if I told y'all what stiff-necked meant, y'all probably wouldn't let me be the pastor of this church anymore. It's bad. It's bad. He said, I've seen them, and indeed they are stiff-necked people. Now he says to Moses, now leave me alone so that my anger can burn against them and I can destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. You can imagine that they are now filled with fear. And they are now hoping that someone would intercede. And here comes Moses in the next chapter, Exodus 33, where it says, Moses says to God, now, if indeed you have found favor, if I have found favor with you, God, please teach me your ways, and I will know you, so that I might find favor with you. Now, consider that this nation is your people. What Moses is saying is the people who are filled with sin, the people who do not believe you, don't love you, and don't want to be with you, these are yours. It doesn't matter what they are doing, they are yours. If you have children and your children lean on the bad side, you might get this, because you understand that no matter what happens to a child, no matter what they get themselves into, they are yours. Some of y'all ain't amening because you the bad kid. And yet you really are the bad kid. All of us are the bad kid. We are all the bad little brother and little sister. And for some reason, there's an older brother that stands beside the father and says, I'll take care of whatever they messed up. I'll clean up all of the mess that they've created. I will be the good son. And they are still your people. And this is what Moses does. He stands on behalf of the people, but we know that Moses is just a great value version of the Jesus that's to come. And Moses says in verses 14 through 17 of Exodus 33, God says, rather, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. If your presence does not go, Moses responded to him, don't make us go up from here. Moses is saying, if you ain't going, I ain't going. Verse 16, how will it be known that I and your people have found favor with you unless you go with us? I and your people will be distinguished by this from all the other people on the face of the earth. Verse 17, the Lord answered Moses, I will do this very thing you have asked, for you have found favor with me, and I know you by name. Look at verse 18. Then Moses said, please let me see your glory. In this moment where they have this back and forth, you might have missed it. It might have gone over your head. But Moses says, I ain't going nowhere unless you're going. And God says, well, I'm going, so let's go. And Moses says, well, before I go back and tell the people, show me something. I need to see something. Show me your glory. Think back to when Moses saw this burning bush and he understood the glory of God, the weightiness of God, the power of God. And as he's beginning this journey once again with those people who are obsessed with sin, he says, no, you got to show me something. And the word glory, I'm wrapping up, y'all. The word glory is the word kavod. It means weightiness. It means heaviness. It means splendor. And after Moses sees the glory of God, he comes down from the mountain. He instructs the people. And for the next few chapters, from 33 to 40, they are building this place where God's presence can rest. They're creating this sacred space. And listen, I wish we had time, but it's a magnificent place. That there are stones of onyx there. There are gold pieces that are crafted there. He says, take some skin from this animal, some leather from this animal. I want you to tan this and make this red and make this blue and make this purple. I want you to construct it in this way. And he creates what's called a tabernacle for his presence to rest in. And this tabernacle was a space where God would always be. This tabernacle would be a place where God would rest with his people. See, a tabernacle is a tent. And a tent serves a certain purpose. A tent says, while I'm in the wilderness, I still need a place to rest. See, God didn't tell them in the midst of the wilderness to go ahead and find some bricks and make a palace for him, because God did not intend to keep them in the wilderness. Are y'all getting this? God does not intend to keep you in the wilderness. He only gives you this space so that you will not forget the promise. He only gives you this space that's temporary, can be put up and travel with you wherever you go, so that you can be aware of the fact that no matter where you go, whatever mess you get into, God is still with you. And that just brings us to our last point. The deep intimacy with God comes from resting in his presence. Deep intimacy with God comes from resting in his presence. See, what did we talk about before? That nobody rests with you unless they are intimate with you. That there's not a guest that's going to push past the space and does not want to be intimate with you, but wants to be close to you. That's what we call stalkers. But when someone is intimate with you, they want to be close to you. God is giving you his presence so that you can rest in it. He's creating this space so that you can rest in it. This is what we know the tabernacle to be, a dwelling that can be packed up so that he can go with you. And this brings us back to the garden once again. Because the place that God had created for his people so that they might find rest has now been replicated in a mobile garden for them. That now, every time they enter in this space, they can feel the presence of God. And that takes us all the way to the last chapter of Exodus, the last few verses. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 40. Because in this, as they are building this tabernacle, they are waiting for the time where the cloud would come off the mountain, roll down, and center it right here in its space. And this is the last few verses of the entire book of Exodus. The cloud, the glory cloud of the Lord, covered the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. And the glory of the Lord, look at this, filled the tabernacle. The story starts in Exodus chapter 2, where Moses can see the glory of the Lord, but he cannot be with the glory of the Lord. The story ends. It ends after God has delivered his people. He's been with his people. He's helped them see the redemption that's coming, and he fills the space. Look at verse 35. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it. And the glory of the Lord again filled the tabernacle. But look at the last few verses. The Israelites set out whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle throughout all the stages of their journey. If the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord, the glory of the Lord, was over the tabernacle by day, and there was a fire inside the cloud by night, visible to the entire house of Israel throughout all the stages of the journey. All this means is that God was with them all the time, and the moment that the cloud lifted, they knew it was time to go. That they did not find themselves in places where they left without God. And there's a message there for us. There's a message there for us that none of us should be willing to move without the glory. That you should not be in a rush to take on something else without the glory preceding you. And there's also a message there where if God's glory has left, then you should not stay. If God has exited left, then you go left. There is no time where you stay because you want it or because you're comfortable or because you have control here. No, wherever God goes, you go. Because that's what intimacy is, isn't it? That the glory fills the tabernacle to show that he is here. God leads his people by this cloud that moves to let them know where to go. And they are attached to God in this relationship. As we reflect on the presence of God, do you look at him in that way? Do you look at him as one who is with you all the time, showing you where to go, how to go, when to go, or do you treat him more like Siri? To answer the questions that you have, to give you wisdom that you need, and to put him back away when you do not feel like you need him. We had the presence. We have the promise. Now we have the tabernacle. The tabernacle, although it is not permanent, it is indeed for us. Because being a presence of love that helps move his people is the story of God. There comes a point where every child realizes that they can be independent. But a mature child knows that when their parent is there, then there's no need to pull away. So here's my challenge to us this week. 1, make space for God in your dwelling. That if God has knocked on your door, he's made sure that he's tried to enter your space, you do not stand at the door and push him away. Make room for God. Don't do your regular routine. Wake up, brush your teeth, get ready to go without acknowledging the fact that God is indeed with you. Don't get in that car and drive down the street towards your place of employment without acknowledging that God is with you. When you lay down at that pillow at night and it all hits you and stress fills your life, do not let go of the fact that God is with you. Make space in your daily life for the presence of God. Here's challenge number 2. Do everything you can to live as a person marked by the presence of God. So there are opportunities that have come your way, and you cannot do it because God is not there yet. There are relationships that might enter the space. You cannot go because God is not there yet. See, God intended for the tabernacle to be a mark of his people so that they might experience his presence all the time. God has done the same with us by sending his son who has tabernacled with us. He's made room in this earth with us. He's defeated death, and death could not hold him down so that he could be with us. And in the tabernacle, God's presence dwelt among his people, but access was not readily available for his people until there was a priest that would come. But Hebrews tells us that there is a high priest who made way, tore away the veil, so now that we can be with God in the Holy of Holies. And that's essentially why every single week we celebrate our gathering with the Lord's Supper. Because much like the tabernacle, where there was bread and there were ornate things that reminded them that God is with them, we have this promise from God that when we take on the bread and the wine, it's a reminder that he's here. It's not as if when you put that wafer on your tongue, he comes down. No, God is with you right now. He's shown us this through his sacrifice. And we now have direct and intimate access to God. Have you made yourself God's dwelling place? Have you made room for him to rest with you in intimacy and love?